And finally, in this session, I'd like to introduce Professor Monique Raats of the University of Surrey. She is going to present more of the FoodRisc results, looking at the drivers and barriers in FoodRisc and benefit communications for journalists and for bloggers.
Right, it's my great pleasure to be here this afternoon and to be speaking to you. I'm going to again be speaking about some of our FoodRisc data and hopefully be echoing some of the earlier things said by the speakers in this session. We felt it was important in FoodRisc to actually bring the voice of journalists into the project. We had that on two occasions. At the start of the project, we did a number of interviews, and then later on in the project, we did again. And it's about those interviews that I'm going to talk to you about. And what we were trying to do is understand the drivers and barriers to risk-benefit communication that they come across in the work that they do to really better understand their practices that can then inform discussions around how best to communicate risks and benefits. So what did we do? What research questions did we pose? We really wanted to understand, as I said, the practices of journalists and bloggers. Originally in the project, we wanted to sort of contrast those working in the social media and those working in the classical media. But of course, as you know, and as time has gone on, those borders have blurred, and really people are working in both those areas. People aren't defined by one sphere or another. But we wanted to understand how they perceive their roles, how they choose the issues that they write about, what sources do they use, how effective do they think those sources are, what channels do they use and why, and then finally what barriers do they face and feel that there are to effective communication about risks and benefits. So the methods that we used were interviews. We did semi-structured qualitative interviews in 4 countries, and partners in each of the countries did those interviews. That was the UK, Belgium, Germany and Spain. And we wanted respondents who had reported on either the dioxin contamination of animal feed in 2011 or the E. coli contamination of vegetables in Germany in 2011. And we had help from colleagues in an earlier study in the project, the one you heard about this morning on dioxin, to help us identify some of those journalists, but we had to use some other methods as well. Interviews were done by telephone, face-to-face, or via the internet, and interviews were anywhere between 45 minutes and an hour, and they were audio recorded. And then we produced transcripts from those. The data were anonymized, and we did coding within each country. So we kept the data in the original language, and then did reports based on those interviews, which were then used for analysis. Now, I'm not going to really talk about country differences. We treated the whole sample, and that was really also coming from the data as a totality, as a whole, and it was sort of the voice of journalists as a group, and not sort of contrasting what do UK journalists do differently than Spanish ones or German ones or Belgian ones. This is something about the sample. So we really separated people into professional journalists and bloggers, and then we separated bloggers into hobby bloggers and expert bloggers. And those of you quick with the numbers doing sums, you'll see that they don't sort of add up. People actually operate in both those spheres, so we will in some cases, depending on what the comment was, have classified them as one as both. So we had between 8 and 9 interviews in each country. And I'll sort of go through and really contrast these 3 groups and the perspectives of those where possible and where they're similar. So how do people perceive their roles? Well, professional journalists perceive themselves as qualified professionals. They operate within a framework. It's something that they've been trained to do. And there are sort of agreed practices and expectations around how you act and how you operate as a journalist. They serve the public as a whole, or in some cases niche audiences, depending on who it is that they work for and who they produce material for. And they see themselves very much as translators of science for the public, so that's very much in line with the presentations that we've just had before. It's a little bit different if we look at the bloggers, but here we sort of see that separation between the hobby bloggers and the expert bloggers. Hobby bloggers perceive themselves to be providers of information. Some of them have fairly altruistic motives, wanting to do good, create a better world, and see themselves as a role to play there. And a small number also describe themselves as entertainers, wanting to put out interesting and fun messages. Expert bloggers, however, talk about themselves as disseminators and translators of science, so quite similar in parallel to the professional journalists, and use routines that are sort of similar to those of professional journalists. So what is it that people report on? Food isn't seen as an important topic. Professional journalists say this because it's important, because it's relevant to all of us. We all deal with food on a daily basis. And food topics are popular ones. They drive readers to the things that they write for, so they will be of interest to use to bring people to where they are producing their media for. And bloggers also highlight food as being an area of shared interest. A nice quote there, my primary audience is people. We all eat, therefore it's of interest. So what is it in terms of issues that are reported on? In terms of food risks and crises, professional journalists really talk about they're more likely to write about food risks than benefits because they satisfy what it is that is termed hard news, what it appears on the front pages in current affairs. They're topics that are episodic, they have immediacy, and they disrupt the status quo. So they're the ones most likely to meet the expectations of wanting to appear in headlines in sort of towards the front end of materials. On the other side, food benefits are much less likely to be covered in news and current affairs because they lack those characteristics that hard news has. They're not immediate, they don't disrupt status quo, so there's less of an obligation, really, is felt that one needs to report. They aren't the stories, that's sort of the message that we sort of heard a little bit earlier. And where things are considered to be important, sometimes they appear in other parts of the media, so the lifestyle sections of media outlets. It's a little bit of a different arena than would do the food risks. And we talked also really about that with bloggers as well, and there we sort of had the message that it was much less systematic. Again, a little bit of a difference there between whether it's a hobby blogger or an expert blogger, but there it was much more what's of interest. Sometimes it was driven by the media itself. That came up earlier in one of the presentations as well. The media isn't, and the social media doesn't just function there to feed the public. It is also the means by which all professionals communicate with each other and gain their information from. So that was another source of stories. And bloggers also felt it important to provoke debate and initiate debate with their audiences. So saw that as part of their role. So what sources do people use? In terms of food risks and crises, a wide range of sources are used. The regional, national and European agencies that are responsible for food risks. For communicating about food safety, various NGOs, blogs, Wikipedia, Google, Internet, anything and everything's being used to identify source material. For benefits, a little bit different. Hobby bloggers don't really talk about using authoritative sources, again, using the media itself. And professional journalists and expert bloggers talk much more about using published academic studies, talking to the authors of those studies, and looking at other science alerts that exist from organisations, again, as we've heard about today. Less really referred to regional, national and European agencies, government agencies as a source, the food safety agencies as a source for benefit stories. So what were some of the themes around this source, establishing what sources to use? A big issue for people, particularly the professional journalists and many of the expert bloggers, was validation of source information. And that comes back to those practices. As a journalist, it's important source of information, and credibility of source is important. So that is what a lot of the work that a journalist does is about, is trying to establish that the sources are credible. The issues having to deal with between speed and accuracy, again, have come up many times today. There's a lot of tension between the two, so practices have to adapt to the pressures that people are under. And also this fact of context and balance that many of them talked about. There's a responsibility to for the professional journalists and many of the expert bloggers to provide a sense of balance and context about the story. So not just the mere facts, but sort of really building that out into what is a true story, so that people have full understanding of the issues. So, as I said, the importance of story. So not just delivering factual information about the risk event, but really trying to understand its context. And then this thing of speed versus accuracy. People need quotes under lots of pressure. Who do you get them from? And then again, back to, are they accurate and the ones that I want? The issues in terms of reporting food risks and crises are really that people feel that they can't get access to the information they need. Sources can be perceived to be slow. Press offices not working in the most optimal way that people can get the access to the information that they need. And getting quotes from experts can be difficult, particularly in a time of crisis. And also the accessibility of language, again, an issue that's come up many times today. Can people read and understand the way that the information is being put out by either the agencies or scientists themselves? And issues around accurate and appropriate reporting on food benefits really relate to that people, particularly professional journalists, feel that they need to exercise even more caution. Can we trust the information, the sources of information about these stories? Is there not somebody there who has is something to gain from that these stories are getting out there? So there's even more critical reflection as to whether these sources are the right ones. So people feeling that benefit stories can't be trusted at face value, needing much more investigation to get the full and true picture. As I said, we used the context of some of the stories that were in the news at the time as an issue that we also talked to our respondents about, and that was the EHEC and dioxin, and whether they perceived there to be differences in the stories, and got the descriptions of that. There were, of course, very clear differences. EHEC was something where deaths occurred. There was a considerable length of time before the source was known, and it was described as posing an immediate threat to health, whereas dioxin was somewhat different, not regarded as an immediate risk to death. And there was much more of a long-term threat to health. And here it was quite clear that the source was identified quickly. But what we also saw here were some interesting differences in terms of what was the story. And we saw in particular with regard to EHEC that the story immediately became much broader than just risk per se. And into it was brought all the discussions to do with economics and political factors that became just as much part of the story. And I think sometimes we feel as food risk communication people that we want to maybe ignore that that's not part of the story, but that is as much something that needs to be dealt with. And whether you regard that as noise or part of the story is something important to consider. And there were also some differences in terms of the effectiveness of authoritative sources. There was it was felt by many of the people we spoke to, a fragmented approach between the various authorities, and that made it again difficult for them to sort of build appropriate stories. But there was also this recognition that they were under pressure and having to deal with very difficult, a difficult context to give appropriate information. And then finally, we also spoke to people about what channels do they use. Coming back to this, as part of being a journalist and a blogger, you are active in that field and draw on the media. And we spoke to them about how it was and how they used digital media channels. And many of the professional journalists sort of talked about that they felt they had a lack of digital skills. There were so many new channels, and really, having the time, given all the pressures on them to sort of build that into their practice and really know how to use things in optimal ways. So it was really, how can we in our day-to-day work build these things in the best way possible? And I think in some ways, seeking guidance and discussion about what might be the best way to do that. There was also discussion of specific tools. Facebook was mentioned, that many people said that's something I use personally. It's not something that's part of my professional being. Twitter, there was some variation. People sort of said they used it for finding out about breaking news stories. It was a way of obtaining story feeds, and it was also a way of engaging with one's readers and putting stories out there. So there was some sense of there were multiple uses for a medium like this. And the other issue around channels was this discussion around credibility and trust. And we talked about that with regard to the new media specifically. But here it really came out that it wasn't, you don't talk about how much can you trust a channel. It's really trusting the sources, the authors of the content that come through these channels, which was regarded as being important. And that's, of course, something also in some channels that's much easier to identify as where's information and who is it really coming from. So in some cases, the credibility of some materials was questioned, but then if you trace that back to who the authors were, then some materials was regarded as appropriate and good to use. And what we also did was sort of seek advice. How can you as a community be helped? What is it that the wider world can do so that you as journalists feel that you can do a better job? And these are some of the things that the journalists said to us and asked that we sort of put out there and say, this is what we would request. It would be for those around them to communicate more proactively, to provide information over and above what's being officially published. So not just mere facts, but some context to help them build the stories, because facts are not the only part of what needs to be there for a story. To increase communication on levels of uncertainty and degree of risk, again, a theme that we've heard many times today, and increase one's own presence on social media and be more effective in self-promotion and broadcasting, so be an active player in using some of those channels. But in that, don't forget the traditional channels. They don't fall away. They still need to be there and be used. So it increases the challenge for agencies and authoritative sources to maintain and really provide information through all those channels. And then really recognise the importance of effective monitoring and managing the emotional and economical response to food risks and crises. So that broader context of stories, it isn't merely the facts and figures about the scientific risks, it's also understanding the implications and impact that might have. And then finally, some really practical ones: improve the processes, make it easier to get people. They want to talk to people on the phone, in person. It isn't enough to just be able to download a bit of information. They need to be able to ask the questions that they want answered. Thank you.